Apollo was roughly 150 billion in today's dollars, so 20 to 24 in the dollars at the time. And now we have, 50 years later, an announcement from our vice president that we're going to go back to the moon in 2024, which was certainly a surprise to the Europeans involved with that endeavor, who were quoted as saying, I went to bed one night, we were going back to the moon in 2028, I woke up the next morning and we're going back to the moon in 2024. But whatever the case may be, it appears that we're going to do this adventure again, which I find very exciting. So I guess my question for the panel here is, in 1961, Kennedy announced that we were going to go to the moon with just 15 minutes of spaceflight experience under our belt, suborbital. The Soviet Union had beat us to orbit. The Soviet Union beat us to the first spacewalk. They beat us a whole bunch of space first, and of course they beat us with Sputnik. But somehow, back in the 1960s, between 1961 and the middle of 1969, we accomplished about 30 years of work in 8. And it's something that we've had a hard time reproducing since then. A number of presidential administrations have tried to recapture this lightning in a bottle. We've seen this come and go with George Bush Sr. and George W. Bush, Reagan with Space Station Freedom, and so forth. And not one of those programs has really taken root and been fully funded in the way that Apollo was. So I know that there are different geopolitical considerations and so forth, but I think one of the things that we would agree on is that the first space race had a clear and concise goal. It was a bold challenge, it was time limited, it was competitive because we had the Soviet Union to push against, which China may become in the upcoming decade. And it was well and fully funded. And I don't think we're going to have that kind of program again, but I'm wondering, in your point of view, what made that work and what do you see in the future? And Shelby, if you would start, please.
Well, I think just briefly that is it on? Where are we here?
I think it's on. Yeah, you see it real close.
Okay. Apparently, as a country, we're more motivated based on competition with a rival than for the natural, scientific and other reasons. And I think with the advent of perhaps China or somebody, that would give us the kind of boost we need. However, I personally feel we should explore space for the pure science and what the benefits are to our society. And I think that's what was lacking, it's what's still been lacking, and we need to publicly talk to our politicians to find some way of self-motivating without having to compete with China or Russia or anybody to do what we need to do for the benefit of mankind in general.
Hear, hear. Francis?
I'll defer to you, Jerry. So.
Well, I've given this a lot of thought, and I do a lot of research on this topic for my audiences. And I've come to summarize that question with 2 words, commitment and hope. And to put it in perspective for you, I want you to go back to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. We were living in a country, we had a culture in this nation at that time that was just totally decimated by that event. But there was a commitment and a rally in this nation that has never been seen even since. And I specifically talked to the fact that in order to ramp up for the Second World War, this nation had to produce the aircraft that were needed for that strategy. There were, the total production in 1941 of aircraft in this country was 9,000 aircraft. Total production. 9 months later, and I'll let you know it was North American Aviation that helped do this, we ended up producing 90,000 aircraft. 90,000 aircraft in the hands of our soldiers in less than 9 months. Now, I'm sorry, I have a lot of confidence in our kids in the future. I do not think that that would be possible today for lots of different reasons. But the other thing that happened was my father, who came back from the Second World War, and all those GIs that were coming back, they were coming back having won. And they were tired of the destruction and all of the damnation of war and what it caused. They wanted a future, and that future they want it for their children. So if you look at all of the materials and everything that was happening in the late 40s and the early 50s, what you saw were every house is going to have a screen on the wall that shows you pictures. It's going to have, you're going to have communicators you carry around and talk wirelessly. You're going to have rocket cars and backpacks, rocket packs. It was a future that was unbounded. And for myself growing up in the 50s like that, it was, yeah, that's great. Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, we're going to go do that. We're going to make all of that real. That's our future. And that is the hope we had. Now, what happened with the space race was while we had those dreams of doing it, all of a sudden, one of our Cold War enemies is saying, well, we can do that too, and we're even better than you. So this competition factor kind of catalyzed this whole process into, well, we got a race on. And we just beat the world in a world war. We can certainly do this space race and win it. So when Kennedy got up in front of everybody and said, we're going to go to the moon and we're going to do it in 10 years, for those of us that were the contractors, we're just shaking our heads saying, oh my God, does he know what he's saying? He's not the one that has to build it. But we had the men and the women, many of them right here in this room today, that were able to make that happen and achieve that goal. That is really what our past has done. That's the legacy that we leave for the children we have today. Now, for those of you that are young, frequently I speak to college groups and engineers and they say, come in and tell us what it takes to be an engineer. Hey, I can tell you what it took to be an engineer years ago in a different culture and a different time in the world of the cosmic Camelot. I can tell you what that was like. But you know, I can't tell you today what's going to happen. I hear this 2024, 2028, we're going to go to the moon, we're going back to Mars. And then I look at where they are in their test programs and I look at what they are doing and I look at the bureaucrats and all the rest of it. More importantly, I look at students and programs I'm teaching right now in middle school who are that workforce that has to make that happen. And you know what? If you look at a lot of those young kids, they are not motivated. They don't care. They just want to know where they're going to get the next fast food meal, where they're going to sleep tonight, and who they're playing on Fortnite. You know, that's their world. And I asked my granddaughter recently, I said, help me understand where young people are today. Because the future that we're going to have, and if that 2024 is going to happen, and the 2028, and the 2030, if any of that's going to happen, they're the ones that are going to have to do it. So what's going on? What's in their heads? And she told me, she says, Grandpa, it's not that hard. They're distracted. And I said, why? And she said, Grandpa, do you watch the news? Do you listen to what's going on? And I have to admit that maybe there's some insight there that maybe that is part of the problem. We need to give the youth, we need to give the people that are going to write this future and make the future some hope. We need to help them make the commitment. And I'm hoping, and like some of the things that we're doing here, all of us who've been there, done that, we need to share with them what the problems are that they've got to look out for and how to help them get there. So that's my take.
I want to go back to something you said, Rod.
I think, here, tap it, let's make sure it's on. Tap it. Yeah, it's just the gain's just low.
Okay. You know, when Kennedy made his announcement, as you said, there was a specific goal with a specific time frame. And I think today, you know, some of the feedback that I hear from people is, why did we go to the moon? Why did we do the space shuttle? Why did we build the space station? And our leadership needs to articulate the value of doing these hard things and making these technical advances. And they need to stop dumbing everything down. If they explain it, people can understand it, but they don't take the time to actually articulate that, and then they don't make the long-term commitment. We've seen it on all the programs we've worked on. You start off with a funding profile, and then it goes down, it never goes up, it goes down, and then they wonder, why are you over budget and behind schedule? So we need to make the commitment. You're seeing this in China today, where they've made the commitment to go to space, and now they want to go to the moon, and their young people are excited, and they're going into STEM fields in college in unheard of numbers. And we don't have anything like that, that, as Jerry said, is hope and a motivating force.
We tend to make a mistake of making it look too good and too simple. There was a gentleman, an author, I can't recall his name right now, but he did a study on time. He wanted to see, does a documentary, if you watch a documentary on the African nature, in 1 hour, 60 minutes, you will see 12 different species, 15 different zones and weather and all of this. Our media compresses time down for obvious reasons, because you're not going to sit there and watch 3 days of what really happens on the belt in Africa. So we compress that time down. Now what happens is, in our particular case, is I would talk to people about Apollo. Oh, gee, wonderful, you went to the moon. Yeah, but you know, there's part of the story you don't see. And the part that many of you relate to is the fact that, you know, when we got here every morning, it was, how many mistakes are we going to make? And we made a lot. Every day it was 90 mistakes and 10 successes. You make more mistakes and failures so that you can find out which is the right way to go, especially if you're doing a program like putting men on the moon that nobody's done before. So understanding that failure is a part of the learning process, and that it's okay to have those failures. But like my good boss George Diaz always told me, he says, it's okay to make a mistake. Don't make the same mistake twice. That's the difference. And so we need to encourage these kids to get out there and try to do. And you know what? You're not going to be president of the company 3 months after you come to work for them. It doesn't work that way. Although there are some companies, I guess, where you can do that.
You know, I just had a thought, how many kids these days do not have an iPhone or a computer?
How many adults don't?
Most of them do, and I guess they must think this just evolved out of the blue. These are derivatives or spin-offs out of the space program. I think if next generations were taught or learned to appreciate the benefits that got out of it, beyond just going to the moon or whatever we've done in the space station, we use materials and things every day that were derived in the space program. They need to know that.
Okay, so we've gotten through 2 questions out of my 4 pages so far, so that's pretty good. We're about a third of the way to the program. I just, if I may, and this is not in opposition to anything you've said, but I just want to say something for young people, because they're a little underrepresented in the room today. You know, I watched my 24-year-old son grow up with a cell phone in his hand and in his face, from the time he got it pretty much till right now. I didn't let him play video games till he was 12 because I felt that was a black hole, but that was just my decision. But I have to say, of the kids I do meet of this generation, I do a lot of youth work too. Well, let me just say at JPL, you know, there's an open house every year for 2 days, one weekend. I think there's 17 or 20,000 tickets available for that. They're gone in about an hour and a half. The second they go online, they are gone.
Yeah, half an hour.
Half an hour. And if you go to that open house, and it's in July or August, it's a really rough time to be up in San Gabriel Valley, standing on the JPL campus, which is white concrete on white concrete with white marble walls, you know, so you're basically in this big heat dish. But there are a lot of kids there, slack-jawed, just amazed at what they're seeing. And if you've been to JPL, most of it isn't all that amazing. There's a few really cool things, but by and large, it's a bunch of big cement buildings and old government facilities. It looks like any other space center without the rockets. But they are really engaged, really excited. I help do a conference every year called the International Space Development Conference. We get about 500 to 600 kids there, which is about half the total attendance. Most of them from India and Eastern Europe for some reason. Haven't quite figured that one out yet, especially the Eastern Europe part. But they are rabidly fanatic about advancing and moving ahead. And the one difference I will say I see between the Indian and Chinese students and the American students, there's a lot of concern here about declining academic standards and so forth. The one difference I see in them in their 20s and 30s, though, is that the American students seem to have more ability to think creatively and independently because they haven't been trained in this kind of rote memorization system. So without getting too carried away here, I just want to say I do see hope. I think your points are all very well taken, and we can do a much better job. And frankly, NASA could do a better job of selling itself and its goals. But they're kind of limited by that charter they've got. They've only got a really limited budget for that, which is a little distressing.
Which the administration has tried to zero out, NASA's education budget.
Yes, and I was very
Only
excited.
Congress has reinstated.
In last year's budget, they wanted to zero out that instrument they had already put on the space station that was an environmental monitoring instrument. Ooh, bad. And that cost $1.8 million per year to run. They wanted that out of the budget, which I figured out by at least publicly available records is exactly 2 days of Secret Service protection for golf at Mar-a-Lago. But that's, a different story. So, we're coming up on this new space age. I thought until a few weeks ago it was going to be less geopolitical in nature than the old one, but after the speech I heard, maybe not, because Russia and China are kind of the bad guys again. I don't know about Russia. I think we stopped flying Soyuz. We're going to see that program kind of, but we'll see. But one way or another, we've got this new space race coming up. I think it's going to be primarily commercial in nature, but that's just my opinion. But it's going to be a different workforce. It's going to be a very different looking workforce. And I was wondering if you could comment on, A, what you think that brings to this new space age, having a truly diverse workforce, because we're getting a lot more really fine brains in there that might not have had access back in the 1960s. But also, given the fact that NASA was kind of an early adopter in terms of diversity of how the space race era may have helped pivot us to where we are now.
My take on that is going back to the early 50s when I was in high school and college before I joined Rockwell. I remember in the late 40s, namely 48, 52, and I believe 56, we were competing with the Russians in a race on the ground. And when I look back, I recognize that the composition of our team for the first time was comprised of women and blacks. Blacks had been in before, but women had been eliminated, had not been allowed to participate in the Olympics. We learned from that our best team had to be diverse. The Russians were known to have great women teams, so we stepped up to the plate and included women and minorities. And from what I recall, when the space program started, I was in the space program 10 years before civil rights. And I look back and I say it was the same thing as we were now in another race with the Russians. The composition of our best team had to include women and minorities. So I was permitted to get in a career started in aerospace, like I say, a full 10 years before civil rights. And I attribute that to the Cold War. We had learned that the formula to beat the Russians had to be inclusive, had to be diverse. And I drew the day that we would make sure that everything we do has the best possible talent from all the pools required without any relegation of some to subordinate roles in favor of others. I still have hope, and I keep hope alive. One of these days we might just live up to that principle of equal opportunity for everybody, bar none.
As I said earlier, I started working at Rockwell in 1980. At that point in time, the engineering workforce nationwide was about 4% women. You know, and I started working and I thought, okay, it's going to take a generation. When I left 35 years ago, it was 11%. Woohoo! Not a very big improvement over more than 30 years.